Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is the sort of week that wound up feeling a little busier because I wound up covering more and doing a lot of prep for weeks ahead. But hey, we got some rhythm going, even with one of the best of the week that's already been highlighted in a separate review. Let's get into it. This is On the Pulse. We got 7 on the docket. Well, let's just start off with from Kesha, High Road.
It's worse than that, 'cause you hurt me and I don't react.
So I actually already reviewed this album over on ARTV with John, where to both of our surprises we came to the same middling conclusion, albeit for different reasons. I will say that the lack of label support seems flagrant in the production budget, but also that I'm not sure how much of a budget would have actually saved this album. It's not her best songs. But apparently Kesha said this is her last real pop album, so if this was just dropped to satiate label obligations and move on, who knows. Anyway, 6 out of 10. If you haven't heard it, it's worth hearing. Next up from We Are the City, R.I.P.
And it's gonna be sad music.
Okay, this is another weird one. Canadian experimental indie rock band, although I'd be more inclined to throw them into prog for their usage of weird electronica, off-key melodies, and peculiar structures and time signatures, where you're almost surprised how visceral some of these songs wind up being off of Kane McKenzie's reedy, shifting, but powerful voice. My most immediate observation going through their back catalog is that they should be a lot more boringly conventional than they are, given some of their pretty obvious influences. A lot of Bon Iver, Mew, a little Ramona Falls, and Ott, and the generally muted, almost calculated vibe and atmosphere, along with the abstract writing style in most of their songs, especially their fractured, abortive 2018 experiment At Night. But R.I.P. is a shift back to more immediate experimentation. And look, I would recommend this project simply for the opening track Killer B-side music, which is easily one of the best songs I've heard thus far this year, just in terms of sheer explosive, dynamic power, but it's also not really representative of the album as a whole, which dials into the warping, slightly off-kilter, jagged guitar bounce, the shuddering grooves, and the synth atmospherics that are their general purview. But it is a return to form for as fractured as it is, an album that's looking to contextualize grief at the loss of a close friend, where the band drills into the deconstructive therapy of both untangling the emotions, and yet in a twisted way immortalizing them in art, especially when you can tell that they shared a rather messy and complicated relationship, and their memories of this friend are not altogether pleasant. Now, this also exposes 2 flaws, the first being how much this album struggles to maintain a consistent tone, and its sound whipping through returns to normalcy and some raw confessional snippets, which, yeah, it might be the reality, but also shows the second issue of how this passing eventually circles around our frontman's scattered angst, rather than showing more focus. Which again, it's human, it's understandable, but without a more focused thematic core, it does blunt some of the larger emotional impact. That being said, the jumble of sounds in indie rock We Are the City deliver, along with some of the best hooks, does work really well. And I do appreciate when a deconstructed project has a real emotional core, it's not just artifice. Certainly less calculated than they have been in the past, which is very much appreciated. And as such, yeah, I'm erring on the side of positive. Late 8 out of 10, make the time, dig them up, check this out. Next up from Dune Rats, Hurry Up and Wait.
Sleeping in the back of a van.
Yeah, that's some burned out Aussie garage punk, alright. And look, if that comes across a bit condescending, it's not my intention, but Dune Rats is not exactly an act that gives me a lot to say thanks to its blatant 90s retro worship, its frontman's fried and breaking vocals, and perpetually stoned delivery and content. If you spend enough time on Bandcamp, you'll hear hundreds of these acts without even really trying, and not a lot of them stand out. Now, their second album was more brawny and eclectic, showing a little bit more wit and self-awareness creeping in between the lines, but their third, honestly, I hadn't heard such a blunt cleanup job on a punk record in years. They barely even sound like the same band. All that grungy texture and distortion, one of their most prominent distinguishing factors, that was sandblasted away for a cleaner, bouncier pop punk sound with the shouty backing vocals and a little bit more focus on the hooks. which if you're into the blunt power chord basics, you're probably gonna like it. But for a band where the perpetual 90s burnout vibe can lose a little bit of satirical luster, especially when the influences of Blink-182, Weezer, and maybe a smattering of Sublime and The Offspring are so blatant, they did trade texture for a guaranteed, unquestioning audience, and I'm just not as interested or impressed by that. Also, K-Flay is on this album. If that's a name you haven't heard in years, join the club. But if you like what I've described, you'll probably dig this because it is decent, but unless the Aussie flavor wins you over hardcore, you'll probably just go back to the original article. 6 out of 10, really only if you're curious. Next up from Squarepusher, Be Up a Hello. So, in preparation for covering this new release from a near legend in electronic music, a pioneer in experimental drum and bass and IDM, I did the deep dive of going through as many of his classics and stretches of weirdness as I could, and I won't deny that his free jazz influenced sputters of blurry breakbeats, blaring synth, and remarkably textured percussion can sound kind of intriguing and potent. Unfortunately, it's a potency that rarely clicks for me as deeply as a peer like Aphex Twin outside of specific projects like Music's Rotted One Note, and especially Ultra Visitor, probably my favorite of the projects. Now, part of this is a lack of structured melodic progression to really grapple with and stick with me. Part of it is the fidgety desire to drill into freeform, virtuoso playing that can start to drag. And part of it comes with the feeling that once you know Squarepusher's tricks, the frenetic warping just doesn't impress you in the same way. Now, granted, he can still surprise me. That EDM-adjacent experiment in 2015 springs to mind. That was actually surprisingly good. But surprise doesn't always translate to quality, and thus this new solo release 5 years later, well, credit to Squarepusher for embracing more melodies opposite all the synth gurgle and breakbeats, but along the way, a lot of the free jazz flair, the funk, and the sense of atmosphere seems to be thrown out. And even then, it feels like a Squarepusher album that's not all that enthralling. It's kind of flashy, and Terminal Slam is a late album surprise in a great way, especially when all that glitch will pile up, and I do like that, but eventually you'll start asking what all the overexposed color really adds as the sequencing falters and you get the dreary ambient pieces, which is kind of frustrating. Don't get me wrong, I hear the appeal, and in scattered moments I hear where Squarepusher clicks, but I'm a little bit less than you might think. 5 out of 10, really just for fans at this point. Next up from Bandaid Brigade, I'm Separate.
Pretend it's true, even brick and mortar won't.
Okay, how to describe this debut act? Alright, the frontman of hardcore punk act Pairs teamed up with the frontman of Gods of Mount Olympus for a project that's trying to subvert rock genres altogether. And yet, why do I feel like I'm hearing a slice of mid-80s yacht rock matched with 90s prog, maybe a smattering of the goofier side of punk, along the way with some of the production that can sound like an off-Broadway musical or a 90s TV infomercial? And if all that sounds kind of weird, trust me when I say that it actually comes together better than you might think, at least on a compositional basis, with enough familiar tones that actually go down pretty easy. The larger question comes that what you do with that genre pileup, because while this album can feel catchy, it's not long before you notice how the vocals don't exactly have a lot of unique character, with a lot more energy than potency or outright charisma, or how flat some of the synth blending can be, or how much certain influences with a little bit more refinement have delivered similar structures with more care and color, or how the lyrical content falls back into overwritten pitch-black nihilism and self-flagellating depression, juxtaposed against the sort of relationship clinginess that might click if the overall sound wasn't primarily major key yearning. In an odd way, I can hear some parallels thematically with Steven Wilson, or even the last albums from Destroyer and Moron Police, but in all those cases, the self-pity didn't feel as pronounced, or there was a little bit more melodic flair outside the obvious established comfort zone, whereas Bandaid Brigade finds its niche and only seems to leave it for some questionable ideas, like the trap breakdown on Losing Light. Otherwise, I won't deny that it's relatively unique, and Stay Busy is a really good song, but it's got the feel of a cast-off side project, and honestly, not one I'm really inclined to revisit. 6 out of 10, only if you're curious. Next up, from Meghan Trainor, Treat Myself. You know, if there was a project where I would have every good reason to skip it, it would be this. To put it bluntly, I think even a lot of pop fans are looking back on Meghan Trainor's few brief years in the spotlight in the mid-2010s with mild embarrassment. And while there is an inkling of truth to maybe picking up quality when you run out of relevance, that would require that I liked Meghan Trainor as a songwriter or personality to begin with, or trusted any of her production team. So while I'm going to come here with the controversial opinion that this might be her best record, if only because it has nothing close to the awfulness of Dear Future Husband or Me Too, it also has the tone of being in development hell the past couple of years and a real struggle to find any sort of unique sound. Not all that surprising, because her former executive producer, Ricky Reed, took a lot of that same vibe and then gave it to Lizzo. As such, Treat Myself feels really patchy and messy, and whereas Kesha could make the charming because of raw charisma and some sense of internal logic on her last project, this album has none of that consistency, mostly because for every song questioning self-esteem or self-worth and messy relationships, Meghan Trainor is trying to lean into clunky, bad bitch flexing, which hits an absolute low point with Genetics, a song with a Pussycat Dolls of all people that goes all in on that implication. Yikes. And when you consider the writing is just not unique or special enough to showcase a more complex personality, because this was also a persistent issue on Thank You and it hasn't really changed, a lot of this whiplash, it feels like a stretch, but it also makes the moments that do try a little harder and have a consistent groove, like Evil Twin and especially Ashes, stand out as some of her best. There's a little more going on there. But that same mess also translates to the production, where about a quarter of it wants to be in the late 90s and with cadences and grooves that actually flatter her, and the rest just has no clue what it's doing. And when you consider that she's not really an expressive vocalist, she can't flatter more of a funk bass line or work with anything close to hip-hop or trap. I understand ditching all the retro stuff that was kind of embarrassing, but at least it was consistent. But in the end, look, just because this is her best on number of good songs versus bad does not mean it's this inconsistent mess is worth your time. And the fact that it's getting dumped in January of 2020, that says a lot more than when she had more traction. 5 out of 10, not for me. And finally, from Lil Wayne, Funeral.
Thank God it was just a dream!
Am I the only one seeing a parallel between the new releases of Lil Wayne and Eminem this past month? Way too long, indulgent, questionable production choices and guest stars, where both rappers, they do seem sharp and focused until you start digging into what they're actually saying and find all the inexcusable corniness and cringe, because nobody would actually say no to them. The larger problem with Lil Wayne is that he douses himself in auto-tune to do it, which would be fine if it contributed to a unique aesthetic or showed himself innovating with that sound or production. He's got no reason not to, but in reality, Lil Wayne is playing in much of the same territory as so many of his descendants. And while he tends to be a more interesting rapper than many of them in wordplay and flow alone, at least when he cares to be, over the course of 24 songs without any real consideration for sequencing or storytelling, it gets really repetitive. Flexing, drug abuse, and doing drugs off of women's body parts in increasingly graphic fashion, by now it's par for the course from Lil Wayne, so I just don't get shocked or mortified in the same way anymore. And it's just not even that funny in the same way. At least in the Carter 5, there were songs like Mona Lisa that told a story and had a lot of character that stood out. I'd put Uproar in that case too. Here it just sounds like mixtape Wayne on a full-length album, and it reminded me exactly why I stopped listening to Lil Wayne tapes and albums. They just started running together. He's put out so many. Now, I've heard this project gets a little better if you treat it like a playlist and just pick the songs you like the title track, Harden, or maybe even Dreams and Nevermind for me, but I'm also stuck considering Funeral as a whole. And when you factor in some truly awful songs and how so many bad bars and questionable beats overshadow so much of the good stuff, yeah, sorry Wayne, I can't endorse this. Strong 4 out of 10, and you know what, even for the fans, I think they know he's done better. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If you guys want to get more involved in my schedule voting, link to my Patreon is right in the card over here. A lot of the rules are over there. It's currently getting a little busy over there, so if you guys want to get in, get your votes established, that'd be very much appreciated. But hey, if you guys got other comments of what you think about all these albums, right down over there. Make sure to hit the bell for notifications, and I do appreciate those of you guys who actually watched this series all the way through to conclusion, because again, I'm trying to highlight a lot of different stuff, and it honestly feels like I'm doing more work. Let's see how things go. Beyond that though, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.